All right, we have this. All right, so let's start with a praise to Manjushri. Obeisance to Maguru in protecting Manjushri, who holds its heart to scriptural text and believes that things or things as they are, whose understanding shines forth as the sun unclouded by defilements or traces of ignorance, who teaches in 60 ways with a patient love of Father for his only Son. All creatures caught in the prison of samsara, confused in the darkness of their ignorance, overwhelmed by their suffering. Uses stronger thundered proclamation of Dhamma and rises from the stupor of our delusions and frees us from the iron chains of our karma, whose powerful sword of wisdom hews our sufferings wherever its sprouts appear, clearing away the darkness of all ignorance. And Churchill Manjushu's princely body is adorned with the 112 marks of a Buddha, who has completed its 10 stages achieving the highest perfection of a Bodhisattva, who has been pure from the beginning. O Manjushu, loving one, with the brilliance of your wisdom, illuminate the darkness and close in my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so I might gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Supreme Assembly. From the accumulations I collect by listening to the teachings, may I attain the state of a Buddha to be able to benefit all sentient beings. I'll go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the highest assembly. From the accumulations I collect by listening to the teachings, may I attain the state of a Buddha to be able to benefit all sentient beings. I'll go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the highest assembly. From the accumulations that I collect by listening to the teachings, may I attain the state of a Buddha to be able to benefit all sentient beings. All right, so I just got a new computer recharger. Luckily, I was translating this weekend for Senchab Senko Rinpoche. And the teaching started at 4 o'clock Australian time, 4 o'clock afternoon. And as I was preparing for the teachings afternoon, suddenly my computer stopped charging. So there wasn't any electricity going into the battery. So I got completely panicked about having to translate for someone and my computer was not working. So anyway, at the end, I managed to scramble an old iPad, but all my texts were on my computer. So it was a bit of a struggle. And I just got a new recharger. So thumbs up, I'm ready to go. So we continue today with equalizing self with others. Last week, at the end of the tutorial, I just gave you something to think about. The question was, is there a difference between developing impartiality towards sentient beings when you practice the sevenfold cause and effect personal instructions for developing bodhicitta? And here, the section of equalizing self with others, is it exactly the same? Because at least we say in English, developing equanimity versus equalizing self with others, or developing impartiality and developing or meditating on equalizing self with others. So you say that it's the same. Any other views? Yeah, impartial sounds like you don't really care, like whatever happens to others. So it's not a major point, but I wanted to look at the Lamrim Chemo. So the Lamrim Chemo says, let's change the font. Right, there it is. Actually, let's make it bigger even. So when Lama Tsongkhapa in the second volume of the Lamrim Chemo gives an explanation of the seven cause and effect, actually I'll share it with the people at home. The seven cause and effect personal instructions. It begins with establishing a basis for developing this attitude. So let's begin with training the mind in the intent on others' welfare. And first of all is establishing the basis for this attitude. And that has two parts. First of all, achieving impartiality towards living being, and then having affection for all beings. So he says in achieving impartiality, as I've previously explained, the status of the preliminary practices and so forth in the context of the person's and small and medium capacities. Practice these preliminary practices here as well, and then sustain your meditation. It says from the outset, establish an even-minded attitude, eliminating the bias which comes from attachment to some living beings and hostility towards others. Otherwise, any love or compassion you feel will be biased. You will never feel unbiased love or compassion. So cultivate impartiality. So here, Lama Tsongkhapa gives the meaning of impartiality. It says that, sorry? Yeah. So it says that it's even-mindedness of mind that is free from attachment to some and hostility to others. So cultivate impartiality, it says. Then it says the steps for cultivating immeasurable impartiality are as follows. Since you can easily be impartial to a person towards whom you have mutual feelings, first take as the object of your meditation such a person, someone who has neither help nor harm you. Achieve an in-mindedness towards this person, removing your attachment and hostility. And then once you've attained that, then cultivate even-mindedness towards a friend. Your lack of even-mindedness towards this friend is either because of your degree of attachment for him or her, or because of the bias from your attachment and hostility. So you work first of all with a stranger, then with a friend, and then towards an enemy. Your lack of even-mindedness towards this person is due to your hostility, viewing him or her as totally disagreeable. So after you're even-minded towards this person, finally cultivated towards all living beings. So here, when he explains impartiality, he says, I think that it gives an instruction that are somewhat slightly different. I mean, not totally different, but just it gives us, first of all, a sequence in terms of cultivating impartiality. It says, first of all, you begin with a stranger, you remove attachment and hostility. Then a friend, you remove attachment and hostility towards the person. And then an enemy. Another question is, what meditation eliminates attachment and hostility towards these persons? So Kamalashila stages of meditations, the middling stage of meditation, has two approaches. So contemplate as follows. From living beings' viewpoint, all equally want happiness and do not want suffering. Therefore, it is inappropriate to hold some close and help them while keeping others at a distance and harming or not helping them. So actually, this is similar to the meditation of equanimity that or the equality of self and others that we've discussed in the last few days. So we think that all sentient beings, just like me, want to be happy, and no sentient beings wants to suffer. So from living beings' viewpoint, Lama Tsongkhapa says, all equally want happiness and do not want suffering. Therefore, it is inappropriate to hold some close and to help them, while keeping others at a distance and harming or not helping them. Now, so that's the first approach. The second approach is contemplate as follows. From my viewpoint, if I have continuously been reborn since beginning this time, all beings have been my friends hundreds of times. To whom should I be attached? To whom should I be hostile? So there are a couple of, furthermore, with regards to attachment to friends, the Dada-like, the finest Moon's Discourse Sutra says, formerly I've killed all of you, and you have slashed and dismembered me. All of us have been mutually enemies and killed one another. How could you be attached? In accordance with my previous explanation with respect to past and future lifetimes, past lifetimes having been enemies and friends before, in the section of the faults of uncertainty, think about how all friends and enemies can quickly change. By thinking in this way, stop both hostility and attachment. So in this context, your contemplation requires you to make the distinction between a friend and enemy. It is not the notion of friend and enemy that you need to stop, but the bias that comes from attachment and hostility, which are based on the reason that some people are your friends and others are your enemies. So it's an interesting point that Lama Tsongkhapa makes here. You still have friends and you still have those who harm you. So it's not that you need to put a stop to friends and enemies. You need to put a stop to the bias of holding some with attachment and others with hostility. So that's the first point. Then Lama Tsongkhapa goes to the next point and says that it's not enough. You also need to have affection for all of them. So you can say that you stop hostility and attachment in thinking that they want to be happy, they do not want to suffer. Also that in myriad rebirths that I've already been through, some have, they've been my enemies, they've been my friends, they've been my mothers, my fathers, my sisters, my brothers, my partner, and so forth. So to whom should be I attached, and to whom should I be hostile? So here it says that the next step is also to have an equal sense of love to them, an equal sense of affection to them. So it's not just enough to balance out attachment and anger. You also need to have an equal sense of affection. So it says that mostly when I started with this point of the way to develop equanimity, we mostly think that to develop equanimity is to consider everyone as equal. But here Shantideva, Lama Tsongkhapa says that you begin with that, and then you add to that also a caring attitude. You see all of them with an affection, with a sense of affection. So it seems that kind of it sets it apart from developing equanimity. It's like a next step to equanimity. So it says, with having affection for all beings, again, drawing from Kamalashila's text. Moistened by love, your mind becomes like friable, fertile soil. When you plant the seed of compassion, it grows easily and bountifully. Therefore, after you infuse your mind with love, cultivate compassion. The love mentioned here views living beings with affection as if they were dear children, your dear children. By cultivating impartiality, you eliminate the unevenness in attitude that comes from the bias of your attachment and hostility, and the mind becomes like a good field. Kamalashila says here that if you moisten your mind with the water of love, which views all living beings with affection, you then plant a healthy seed of compassion, you will easily generate great compassion. Understand this to be an extremely important point. So Chugila is saying that it seems that this point is like the point that comes up in the fourth and fifth stage of the sevenfold cause and effect personal instruction when you develop loving kindness and compassion to others. So it seems that kind of when we look at Lama Tsongkhapa's explanation of the sevenfold cause and effect personal instructions, he begins first of all with the first three steps. And then He speaks separately of the development of the attitude of being intent on others' welfare and cultivating love, compassion, and wholehearted resolve. So I think that he gives probably more explanation of how you develop love and compassion, but it seems that what he says that you need to have an equal sense of care for others, but then the type of love and compassion that you want to develop after that are strong love and compassion that will be a basis for taking upon yourself the responsibility to liberate all sentient beings from suffering. So isn't it the same as what we have in the commentary this morning? Yeah. So isn't it the same as what we've discussed this morning? You know, in the things that Geshe said, like for example, regarding, for example, your place or country or community or what have you. So developing an equal sense of concern to everyone, wishing for their happiness. So I think that here, it seems that here when we study Shantideva's Guide to Bodhisattva Way of Life, and here we're looking at a section of equalizing self with others. It seems to me that equalizing self with others combines those 2 points that Shantideva, that Lama Tsongkhapa separated in the Lamrim Chemo. So they combine impartiality towards sentient beings, but also developing a sense of care for them, a sense of affection to them. So in the Lamrim Chemo, I'll just put it on the screen again. Yeah, there's also the 11-point method that combines the two. I can't remember all the stages of the 11-point method, but do we have impartiality and equanimity? But they're not separated out. No, I mean equanimity and meditating on equanimity of self and others, and meditating on impartiality. Are the different steps, or are they the same step? No, with the 11 steps method. Sorry. Sorry? So you were talking about it in the discussion. So for those who ask about which page in the Lamrim Chemo, it's in the text itself. It's in page I think 36. Anyway, So do we have equalizing self with others that comes after developing impartiality? All right. So Chugida is saying that in the 11 steps for cultivating bodhicitta, which is a method that combines both the 7-fold cause and effect person instructions and equalizing exchanging self with others, these two, impartiality towards sentient beings and meditating on equanimity, are 2 separate steps. Yeah. So they have the first 3 from the 7-point cause and effect person instructions, recognizing mother, then becoming mindful of their kindness, developing the wish to repay their kindness, and then you meditate on equanimity. But then before you begin with then you meditate on equalizing self with others, but before you meditate on recognizing all sentient beings as being your mother, you meditate on equanimity. So it seems that kind of there might be just a slight difference between equanimity in the sevenfold cause and effect person instructions and meditating on equality of self with others, which seems to include both equanimity, but also developing an equal sense of care for others. So Ollie is asking, what was the question on the 11 steps again? So there is a method that combines both equalizing, exchanging self with others and the sevenfold cause and effect person instructions. So I was wondering if you combine these two systems, whether you meditate on equanimity or impartiality, which is the basis for developing the sevenfold cause and effect person instructions, whether you meditate on that at one point, and then later on a separate stage out of the 11 steps, you will meditate on equalizing self with others. If you meditate on them separately, it seems that also the implication is that there is a slight difference between them. To me, it seems that meditating on equalizing self with others includes impartiality to sentient beings, but on top of that, then developing a sense of concern for sentient beings, developing affection to others. Yeah, particularly as you're a Sha faculty practitioner, according to Shantideva. Actually, when I wanted to touch upon that as well, because today we looked at the reasoning for developing the equality between self and others. So the meditation on equalizing self with others has to do with a relative level, but it also touches on an ultimate level. I think that because it touches on both on relative and ultimate level, it seems to be slightly more difficult to think of. And therefore, you can say that for this reason as well, it is something that probably more of a Sha faculty person, which will make it a more powerful method. So I wanted to continue to draw from Lama Tsongkhapa's text. I wanted to draw another point from that. And then go to what we've covered today. So then in Lama Tsongkhapa Lamrim Chenmo, I put it on the screen. In Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo in the second volume, in chapter number 3, explains the 7 cause and effect personal instructions and then exchanging self and others. So I wanted to go to exchanging self and others. And to look at the section of the ability to exchange self and others if you accustom yourself to the thought of doing so. Sorry, I wanted to look at the third point, which is the status of meditating on how to exchange self and other. So it's an interesting explanation that Lama Tsongkhapa gives here, because it doesn't speak about equalizing self with others. It speaks about the exchange with self with others. But when you look at the arguments that he explains here with respect to exchanging self with others, it includes arguments for meditating on equalizing self with others. So it doesn't separate them out as, first of all, equalizing self with others and then exchanging self with others. You give them, all of them together as part of exchanging self with others. So it says, first of all, therefore, Shantideva's statement above, therefore, just as I conceive of I with respect to the drops of semen that comes later on in the text and blood of others, so you can condition to cherishing yourself as others as you do yourself. So then, therefore, Shantideva's statement above, that you might exchange your own happiness for others' suffering, means to view cherishing yourself as the enemy and then to stop emphasizing your own happiness. sorry, probably when Lama Tsongkhapa says it refers to Shantideva's text above. Therefore, Shantideva's statement above that you must exchange your own happiness for others' suffering. It's in another verse, not the one that we've just read through. So it means to view cherishing yourself as the enemy and then to stop emphasizing your own happiness. In addition, you must view cherishing others as a good quality and stop neglecting others' suffering, and instead emphasize the removal of their suffering. So here Lama Tsongkhapa gives us a brief explanation of what this meditation is, right? So equalizing, exchanging self with others is to view cherishing ourselves as an enemy. Stop emphasizing our own happiness. In addition, we must view cherishing others as a good quality. We need to stop neglecting others' suffering and instead emphasize the removal of their suffering. This is what this practice is mainly about. In brief, this step means that you remove others' suffering while disregarding your own happiness. So the 2 points that I wanted to mention today are those 2 obstacles to training in this attitude of exchanging self with others. So these are the 2 points that are that we need to remember. The first obstacle is that we make categorical differentiation between people who are happy or suffering, yourself and others, yourself and others, and making them as different as blue and yellow. So blue and yellow are not only different, but they're also unrelated to each other, in a sense that if I see blue, I don't need to see it in relation to negating yellow. If I see yellow, I don't need to do it in relation to blue. I can see those colors unrelated in a way that is unrelated to each other. Except that if we put them together, well, yeah. So if we put self and others, what do we get? A lot of people. All right. Small little babies, cute little babies. So the first fault is that we have that idea that self and others are completely, not only different, of course we are different, but also unrelated, right? So there's my suffering, my happiness here, and my suffering here. And there is George's happiness and suffering there. And since George and I are separate, unrelated to each other, I don't need to do anything about George's situation. That's the first obstacle, right? That we see self and others as being unrelated to each other. The second point is thinking that other suffering does not harm me. You must remove the obstacles of thinking, I will not make an effort to dispel other suffering because other suffering does not harm me. So even if Georgie has suffering, even if she's in pain, it doesn't really harm me. Her suffering is not experienced by me, so why do I need to do anything about it? It doesn't harm me. Also, when Georgie is happy, it doesn't really relate to me. So why do I need to do anything about it? Why do I need to accomplish happiness for her sake if it doesn't really help me? So these are the 2 main obstacles that we need to remove in order to be able to reduce our self-cherishing and to cherish greatly other living beings. So out of these 2 obstacles, what we're covering now in Shantideva's text is the first obstacle, right? So now we're looking at the first obstacle, which is making a categorical differentiation between people who are happy or suffering, yourself and others, making them as different as blue and yellow. So then you accomplish your happiness and remove your suffering because you think of them as mine, and you neglect others' happiness and suffering because you think of them as belonging to others. So that's the first obstacle that we need to rid ourselves of. And the verses that we've covered today are verses that deal with this section. So let's look at them. Actually, before we look at the verses, just remind yourself of the outline. So we're looking at a way to meditate on the equality of self and others. So we are abandoning the position that holds, before we get to that, we're looking at a way to meditate on the equality of self and others. We're going to begin today with verse 90. We're going to look at explaining the purpose of meditating on the equality of self and others. And then we'll begin with a way to meditate on the equality of self and others in verses 92 and 93, which we cover today. So in order to then look at the arguments that we use in order to rid ourselves of the first obstacle, which sees ourselves and others as being different and unrelated, let's look at Khenpo Kumpel's commentary to verse 90. And in my tutorial notes, I pulled out a few points from this explanation, because it does give a very good and extensive explanation about these points, drawing on both relative level, but also on ultimate level. So in this text, the Nectar of Manjushu's speech, in page 282, it says at the bottom of the page, verse 90. Actually, we haven't read through this verse. Let's read through that. First of all, I should make an effort to meditate upon the equality between self and others. I should protect all as I do myself because of equal happiness and suffering. So Khenpo Kumpel says two things are to be practiced on the level of relative bodhicitta. Meditation on the equality of self and others, and meditation on the exchange of self with others. Without training in the former, the latter is impossible. This is why Shantideva says that we should first meditate strenuously on the equality of self and others, for without it, a perfect pure altruistic attitude cannot arise. So that's what he establishes in general to begin with. All beings, ourselves included, are in exactly the same predicament of wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. For this reason, we must vigorously train in ways to develop an intention to protect others as much as ourselves, creating happiness and dispelling suffering. We may think that this is impossible, but it isn't. So here, when the commentary says, for this reason, we must vigorously train in ways to develop the intention to protect others as much as ourselves, I take that to include the 2 points that Lama Tsongkhapa mentioned in relation to the sevenfold cause and effect personal instructions. We develop impartiality, free of anger to some and attachment to others, but also develop that equal sense of care to others, wishing to protect them. I mean, this is my own interpretation to this statement. It says, although they have no ultimate grounds for doing so, all beings think in terms of I and mine. Because of this, they have a conception of other fixated on as something alien, though this too has no basis in reality. So all of us have an idea of I and mine, right? This is me and this is my body. This is me and this is my cup. Because of this, because of having those kind of strong determination of I and mine, particularly with respect to this is me and this is my body, we also make strong determination with respect to others. This is others and this is others' body. But I think that the unstated implication in this section is that not only we make such strong determination, also we hold on to them as existing inherently. And when I say existing inherently, it means that we hold on to them strongly as if I exist independently in and of myself, and also mine exists independently in and of myself. And therefore others exist, and what belongs to others exists also in this way. So I'm interpreting in this way because after that in the commentary, Khenpo Kumpel's commentary, it says, aside from being merely mental imputation, I and other are totally unreal. So here Khenpo Kumpel says that there are mental imputation, just mental imputation, that are unreal in the sense that they do not exist inherently. So there is not an inherent I and there is no inherent other, which means that if they're not inherent, they must be dependent. They are both illusory. Moreover, when the non-existence of I is realized, which means not inherently existing I, the notion of other also disappears, which means the notion of inherently existing other. For the simple reason that other is only posited in relation to the thought of I. Just as it is impossible to cut the sky into two with a knife, when the space-like equality of egolessness is realized, it is no longer possible to make a separation between I and other, and there arises an attitude of wanting to protect others as oneself and of taking them as one's own. As it is said, whoever casts aside the ordinary, trivial view of self will discover the profound meaning of selfhood. Thus, for the realization of the quality of I, the equality of I and other, it is essential to grasp that I and other are merely labeled without any basis in reality. This vital point of egolessness is difficult to understand, difficult even for a person of high intelligence. Thus, as the teachings say, it is of importance that egolessness be clearly demonstrated and assimilated. Now, here when it says egolessness, I take that to be selflessness. Could I repeat? Did it mention the great meaning of selfhood? It did. So, as it is said, whoever casts aside the ordinary trivial view of self will discover the profound meaning of great selfhood. So I think that here what Khenpo Kumpa says is, it says self and others are imputed in relation to others. There are only verbal imputations. Of course, on a relative level, me and you exist. But when we look at how I and others appear to the mind, I appears to my mind as if I inherently exist. And you appear to your mind as if you inherently exist. And also we appear to each other as if we are unrelated to each other. But here the text says that I and other only appear in that way, but they do not exist way. They do not exist like that in reality. So first of all, when we think of the equality of self and others, I think that what this section implies is that we need to start shaking the strong fixation that we have to self with others. So we meditate on equalizing self with others, and in overcoming the first obstacle, which holds self and others to be distinct and unrelated, like blue and yellow. Here, we said that this is not correct because they're not like blue and yellow. I can have I only because of others. I can have others only because of I. They're not independent from each other. They're not independent, discrete things, but they can only exist in relation to each other. Since they can only exist in relation to each other, why do we have to make that strong categorical differentiation between self and others as if they're unrelated? So it's quite hard to think about it because we're so used to think of self and others, me and others in a particular way. But here it seems that Shantideva is starting raising questions. Do we really exist in the way that we appear to ourselves? Do we really exist in a way that we're independent from each other? We are not. We can only exist in relation to each other. So that's to begin with in verse 90. And then it says in verse 91, although there are many different divisions and aspects, such as the hands, they are the same in being the body that is to be thoroughly protected. Likewise, all the different migrating beings in their happiness and suffering are the same in wishing to be happy, just as I do. So the point that Shantideva is making here is that we think of ourselves as I, this is me, and this is others. And we are also used to thinking of ourselves in this way. But since I is just merely imputed by language and conception, Shantideva says here that we can develop a different idea of I. Rather than thinking of just me, if I think of everyone else as I, then I can think, I want to be happy and I want to be free from suffering, but it would apply to me as being all living beings, right? So therefore, it would be that equality of kind of thinking that all of us equally want and need to be happy, and all of us equally need to be free from suffering. just because I've now changed my attitude, just not thinking of myself as just me, but I as being all living beings. So in order to explain that, the commentary says, so Dechen is saying, there is also the attitude that I'm one, others are many. So the benefits are far greater waking for others who are many. I think that will probably be presented by Shantideva later on. As far as I remember, there's one verse that deals with that. So then it says in the commentary to verse 91, the way to reflect upon the equality is as follows. We can distinguish the various parts of our bodies, hands, feet, head, inner organs, and so forth. Nevertheless, in a moment of danger, we protect them all, not wanting any of them to be hurt, considering that they all form a single body. We think this is my body, and we cling to it and protect it as a whole, regarding it as a single entity. In the same way, the whole aggregate of beings in the 6 realms, who is in their different joys and sorrows, are all like us in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer, should be identified as a single entity, our I. We should protect them from suffering just the same way we now protect ourselves, right? So we have here a group of organs, a collection of organs. And although the organs are different to each other, hands, arms, and so forth, at time of danger, we protect all of them as a whole. So Shantideva says here also, let's change the sense of I. Let's think of I as being a collective I, which includes all living beings, which are actually they belong to the same collection of I, because all of us are equal. All of us are the same in thinking that I want to be happy and I do not want to suffer. Since all of us have the same basic thought, I want to be happy and I do not want to suffer, we can think of those different things that are seemingly different. We can think about them actually belonging to the same collective, the I that wants to be happy and does not want to suffer. So that's the first point that the commentary makes. And then it continues with that, because it's so different to, it's so outside of the way that we normally think, that we still need to grapple with that a lot. Suppose we were to ask someone how many bodies he had. The person will say, what are you talking about? I have nothing but this one body. Well, we continue. Are there many bodies that you should take care of? The person will say, no, I take care only of this one body of mine. This is what he may say, but the fact is that when he talks about his body, he's doing no more than applying a name to a collection of different items, right? So again, here there is this strong determination that we make with respect to this is my body. And again, this idea that body exists as something that exists completely in and of itself, independently. But here the text says that it's just a verbal designation, a name that is imputed onto the collection of different things, the hands, the arms, the legs, and so forth. So the word body does not at all refer to a single indivisible whole. In other words, there's no reason why the name body should be attached here to these items and why it is inappropriate to attach it elsewhere. The word body is fastened without ultimate justification to what is merely a heap of component items. So the commentary says that we actually we used to think of this body or body as something that applies only to this. But the author of the commentary says, actually, when you think of what it means, we ascribe the name body to a collection of different things. So why can't we regard other collections of things also with the word body? And in fact, when you look at debate texts and the definition that they give for the term body, they said that a body is a collection of its members. So, for example, when you think of a Buddha's body is a collection of different things. So it's not just a physical body of Buddha, but also the mind of Buddha is called a body, in that it's a collection of different things. Sambhogakaya and Imanakaya mostly are persons. Again, they're called body from the viewpoint of a collection of different things. So here Shantideva says, let's look at the word body. We don't have to apply it only to this thing, but we can apply the word body also to a collection of different people that want to be happy. I want to be free from suffering, and I want to protect this body. So it is the mind that says my body, and it is on the basis of this idea of a single entity that it is possible to impute the notion of I, mine, and all the rest. To claim, moreover, that it is reasonable to attach the name I to this aggregate and not to other is quite unfounded. So we might persist in saying that actually it doesn't make sense. It makes sense to call this thing here body, but calling all of us here and also the people at home body is not reasonable. You're not making any sense. So again, thinking about it from the point of view of how imputation by names and conventions work, we are merely imputing names and depends upon certain things. So since a body is a collection of different components, we can also apply the term body to a collection of people. This is a body of people. Consequently, it is taught that the name I can be applied to the whole collection of suffering beings. It is possible for the mind to think that I myself, and if having identified them in this way, it habituates itself to such orientation, the idea of I with regards to other sentient beings will in fact arise with the result that one will come to care for them as one now cares for oneself. So I made just a kind of a point summary with respect to the points that Khenpo Kumpels explains in this section. So let's look at my point summary. So the body has different parts, legs, arms, head, etc. When danger arises, we protect the body as a whole. Similarly, we can consider sentient beings as a whole because all of them are the same in wanting happiness and wanting to be protected from suffering and protect them all. That's the basic premise for this discussion. Then the term body is no more than applying a name to a collection of different items. So it is possible to apply the name I to a whole collection of suffering beings, thinking they are myself. And it is possible to habituate oneself with the idea of I to other sentient beings with the result that one will come to care for them as much as one cares for oneself. Right, so this point in the meditation is pretty hard because it will take a lot of time for us to accustom to think of I as being everyone else. We're so used to thinking of I as just one me. But here Shantideva says, change your orientation. Don't think of yourself alone. Think of I as being everyone else, including yourself, all living beings with the same thought of wanting happiness and wanting to be protected from suffering. It's a powerful practice, isn't it? So Paul says that this planet can be considered as a body with different animals, etc., as parts or organs. Yeah, it is. I mean, particularly when you think of how different animals, but not only different animals, also inanimate things like trees and rivers and so forth. Paul, you know that probably much more than all of us do. All of us are related to each other. No, we are different in some sense, but also we belong to the same body and exist in mutual dependency. One entity and many together, we start to move beyond language and into experiential states. So then the next verse, number 92 and 93, the next two verses, come under the heading of explaining the reason why it is reasonable to meditate on such an equation. Sorry. I should be looking at abandoning the position that holds that it is unreasonable to equate discarding pleasure and taking on suffering. So remember, we're still doing with this obstacle that Lama Tsongkhapa mentioned, hindrance that Lama Tsongkhapa mentions, that we consider self and others to be different, like yellow and blue. And therefore, we might object to equating self with others and saying that it is unreasonable to equate discarding pleasure for ourselves and others and taking on suffering for ourselves and others. So verses 92 and 93 say, my sufferings does not cause any harm to the bodies of others, but that is my suffering due to adhering as it becomes unbearable. So again, my suffering does not cause any harm to the bodies of others, because this is my suffering and this is not Georgie's suffering. They are unrelated to each other, like yellow and blue. And also it says in verse 93, likewise, the sufferings of others does not befall me. The suffering of Georgie is not experienced by me. They are like blue and yellow. Nevertheless, Shantideva says that suffering of me due to adhering to I will be hard to bear. So in Khenpo Kumpa's commentary, it says, there's some more juicy stuff coming. So it says, but now it is possible for, how it is possible for such an attitude to arise, given that others do not feel my pain and I do not feel theirs. The root text may be interpreted as meaning that while these sufferings of mine have no effect upon the bodies of other living beings, they are nevertheless the suffering of my I. They are unbearable to me because I cling to them as mine. So before we go into that, I just wanted to maybe bring up a doubt and discuss it. So Lama Tsongkhapa says that there are two obstacles to exchanging self with others. The first one is to think that me and others are different and unrelated. The second point is, the second obstacle is thinking that other suffering does not harm me. So it seems that verses 92 and 93 on one hand can said to be related to the first obstacle that says that me and others, and that claims that me and others are different, like yellow and blue, and therefore other suffering is unrelated to my suffering. So that's one interpretation. The second interpretation is to say that this addresses the second doubt that Lama Tsongkhapa brings out, or the second hindrance, which is the thing that other suffering does not harm me, and therefore I don't need to do anything about it. So I think that you can use verses 92 and 93 in either way. You can use them in order to dispel these two hindrances. But if you take the position that verses 92 and 93 I explained here in order to dispel the first hindrance, which think that since self and others are unrelated, I don't need to do anything about others' suffering. I don't need to do anything about others' happiness. Here, the commentary, Khenpo Kumpa's commentary says that actually, if you do think of everyone else, you know, everyone else as belonging to the same body of suffering sentient beings, then of course, kind of other suffering does harm you because you think of others as I. So in this way, it belongs to the first, it dispels the first obstacle. So the explanation of verse 93 says, although the pains of others do not actually befall me, because I'm a Bodhisattva and consider others as myself, the pains are mine as well, and therefore unbearable to me, right? So that supports that argument that you can say that since we are thinking of everyone else as being me, of course, other suffering is unbearable to me. So how is it that when suffering comes to me, the pain affects only myself and leaves others untouched? Regarding my present incarnation, just as from beginning this time until now, my mind entered amid the generative substances of my parents, as they came together. Subsequently, there arose what I now identify as my body. And it is precisely because I seize on it as myself that I'm unable to tolerate it being injured. But within suffering itself, there is no separation between my suffering and another's suffering. So we cling onto our body, and we are used to that from our birth. And because that strong clinging to our body, we think of this as my suffering. But then the commentary here says that actually, when you think of just suffering as an experience, suffering as an experience is an experience of pain. That experience doesn't have any thought of my suffering. It is just a painful experience. So it doesn't have that thought, this suffering belongs to me, whereas other sufferings belong to others. It's just an experience of suffering without making any such distinction. Therefore, although one's pain does not actually afflict me now, if that other is identified as I or mine, his or her suffering becomes unbearable to me also. And then it says, Maitreya Gini, a disciple of Lord Atisho, indeed feel the suffering of other beings as his own. This was the experience of one who had attained the Bodhisattva ground of realization. However, even on the level of ordinary people like us, we can take the example of a mother who would rather die than have her dear child should fall sick. Because she identifies with her baby, the child's suffering is actually unbearable for her. Other people who do not identify with the child are, for this very reason, unaffected by its pain. If they did identify with it, the child's suffering would be intolerable for them as well. So I think that probably for those who are parents, or for those who have strong relationship, close relationship with others, close friends, brothers, sister, even a pet, when sometimes they become sick, you have that idea that first of all, it makes you sick. You are unable to tolerate the pain of your, of your brother, sister, partner, child, and so forth. But also, you think that we need to do anything possible, to be free from suffering. So it is possible to do it if you accustom your mind to it. Always asking, by suffering, do we understand it to mean the inability to recognize inherent existence of self and phenomena, or simple mundane pain? Well, I think that here the commentary says that when you just, it says that kind of from a point of view of ordinary beings, we have grasping to the body. And when we have grasping to the body as just being my body, not considering others' body, but just mine, because this is what we have been accustomed since our birth. Then when suffering arises in the body, I think that when we investigate just the experience of suffering, not how I think of suffering, but just suffering as an experience of pain, experience that is pain. Suffering itself doesn't think my suffering. It is just simply an experience of suffering. And therefore, here the notion is that if you think of my body as being everyone's body, then suffering becomes my suffering. The suffering of all living beings becomes my suffering. So is it the inability to recognize inherent existence of self and phenomena, or simple mundane pain? I think that we begin with simple mundane pain, but then we also kind of think of, we can include with that also suffering of change, and even more so pervasive suffering of conditionality. Paul adds to that, not getting what you want, getting what you don't want. Yeah, all the other unexciting bits. So it's 4 o'clock, but there's just one point that I wanted to add to that. It is not there is no the slight of reason for saying that the notion of I must be applied to me and not to another. I and other are no more than matter of conceptual labeling. The I of myself is other for someone else. And what is other for myself is I for another. The notion of here and there are simply points of view, designated by a mind independence on each other. There is no such thing as an absolute here or an absolute there. In just the same way, there is no absolute I and absolute other. It is just a matter of imputation. And so on account of this crucial point, the Dhamma teaches us that when I is ascribed to others, namely sentient beings, the attitude of accepting and taking them as one's own will naturally arise. So we'll leave this here for now, but just with this point, and there are a couple of other points in that section, but we'll discuss them tomorrow. We're trying to break down this notion of inherently existing I and inherently existing others that prevent us from developing the equality of self and others, and thinking that because self and others are different, like yellow and blue, I don't need to do anything about others. So here the last point says, actually, it's just a different point of view. When I look at you, then I think of I, and I think of others or you. But similarly, when Georgie kind of thinks of herself, she thinks of I, and we, all the rest becomes other or you. Just like if you stand on this end, this is here, and what is there is there. But if you go to the other point, to the other end of the room, it would be here, and this side would be there. So self and others are just designations that are imputed from a particular vantage point. So if you think of everyone as others, you can also think of everyone as me because they are mutually dependent. Anyway, I guess that with all these arguments and kind of seeing how complicated they are, we can appreciate how indeed meditating on the equality of self and others and then exchanging self with others is considered to be kind of a more complicated method, but also, I think, quite powerful. So thank you very much. Let's leave it here for now. Due to this virtue, may I quickly become a Guru Buddha and lead all transmigrated beings without exception to that state. May the precious Supreme Bodhisattva not yet born arise. May that the reason not incline, but increase more and more. In this land encircled by snowy mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful residents in Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You uphold the Sibiru's moral way of serves in the bountiful birth of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplishes magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, protective of myself and others, your disciples. Please live long. Tara Puja tonight at 6:30. Be merry.